The phrase trial of the century seems to get thrown around pretty often by the media, especially considering the fact that the name itself implies that there can be just one per century. In fact, it's been associated with so many different cases, Wikipedia has a list of more than 20 cases dubbed the trial of the century at one time or another. So what elements have to be in place to earn the trial of the century designation? Well, sometimes the trial will feature a well-known or wealthy participant. Other times, a grisly murder scene will catch the attention of the public, or maybe a case of passion gone wrong will do the trick. Whatever the caveat, these cases all share one thing in common, and that's the intense media frenzy that surrounds them. One of the earliest examples of this type of case that featured all the ingredients to feed a tabloid-centric 1920s media was the Hall Mills murder trial of 1926. Taking place in Somerset, New Jersey, the case caught massive media attention nearly 10 years before the more well-known Lindbergh baby kidnapping stood trial just next door in Hunterdon County. On this episode of Destination Anywhere, we're going to examine one of the Garden State's most unique unsolved murder cases that's still garnering attention today, almost a century later. The story of the legendary Hall Mills murder case starts down a long dirt road in New Jersey on a September morning in 1922. That morning, two witnesses were in for a gruesome discovery when they stumbled upon the bodies of a man and woman, both victims of gunfire. The male victim, Edward Hall, reverend at a nearby church, had been shot once above his right ear. The female victim, Mrs. Eleanor Mills, received 3 gunshot wounds, all to the right side of her head, as well as some deep cuts to the neck. While the cold-blooded murder was enough to make headlines all over the region, it was the odd arrangement of the murder scene that tantalized the public. The bodies of the deceased were placed side by side, both on their back, with Mrs. Mills on the left. The guilty party chose to place her left arm at Mr. Hall's hip, while his arm was made to touch her neck. A hat was used to cover Mr. Hall's face and deadly head wound, and his personal business card was placed at his feet. Maybe the most curious detail of this sight was the tattered pieces of the couple's love letters sprinkled about the scene. When the bodies were discovered, it was quickly brought to light that the couple were engaging in an extramarital affair. Reverend Hall, who presided at St. John the Evangelist Church in New Brunswick, was married to Frances Stevens Hall for over a decade at the time of the murder. Mrs. Mills, on the other hand, was a choir singer at the church and was married to James Mills, the sexton for the church. As the investigation of the murder scene started, detectives had their work cut out from the very start. It was reported that curious neighborhood onlookers flocked to the scene of the bodies and even began to disrupt evidence, including passing around Reverend Hall's business card. Even with a less than ideal place to start, authorities began a list of suspects. Investigators first turned their attention to Reverend Hall's wife, Frances, who witnesses said was seen entering her home between 2 and 3 a.m., just hours after authorities believed the murders were committed. Frances explained this by claiming she went to the church in the middle of the night after becoming worried at her husband's absence. Naturally, investigators were interested in the whereabouts of Mr. Mills on the night of the murders, who also claimed he went looking for his wife at the church, although neither spouse claimed to have run into each other. Detectives next began to turn their attention to the family of Frances, including her 2 brothers and a cousin. Eyeing revenge for the Reverend's infidelity as a motive, investigators honed in on brother Henry and William Stevens, along with cousin Henry Carpenter. Although local hog farmer Jane Gibson told investigators she had heard and witnessed suspicious activity in the area that night that pointed to the Stevens crew, prosecutors ultimately decided not to prosecute and the case went cold. 4 years would go by before the case would get a second life. When the former maid in the Hall residence claimed to overhear word of a secret elopement between the Reverend and Mrs. Mills shortly before their murder, the tabloid press of the time was quick to reinvigorate the case. On November 3, 1926, Frances Hall Stevens and her brothers were brought to trial. The trial was sensational from the outset, with the newspaper coverage running rampant. The media darling of the trial was the aforementioned hog farmer Jane Gibson, now dubbed Pig Woman by the media. Suffering from cancer but forced to testify, Gibson was brought into Somerset Courthouse on her hospital bed to tell her story. Gibson claimed that she had heard a noise in the field that night and proceeded to investigate. As she got closer, she heard noises consistent with a struggle, as well as gunshots and a voice that shouted the name Henry. While Gibson's testimony riveted the courtroom, one person that wasn't buying it was her very own mother, seated nearby. But it wasn't just Gibson's mom that felt that way, it was the jury as well. With a lack of witnesses and credible evidence, the Stevens gang was acquitted 1 month after the trial started on December 3, 1926. In the nearly 100 years since the murders took place, there have been several books written and numerous theories surmised. Besides the common assertion that it was the Stevens family that caused the murders, others have speculated a wide range of theories, including Ku Klux Klan involvement and the idea that it was simply a random robbery gone wrong. Whoever was to blame, the case certainly hasn't been forgotten. In fact, there's even an active Facebook group dedicated to investigating and bringing new evidence to light called simply the Hall Mills Murder Case. While we may never get an answer to who pulled the trigger on that September evening, the Hall Mills case will go down as one of the great crime mysteries of the 20th century and one of the first examples of a true media frenzy. While many other cases would receive the moniker of Trial of the Century, there's no doubt that this one had all the key ingredients well before the phrase was routinely doled out. Before I go, I want to give a special thank you to investigator Kim Kowalczyk for all his help in putting this together, which I couldn't have done without his help. Well, that's all for this episode of Destination Anywhere. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to the Mickey Shuffle on YouTube.